All going. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Again, my name is Mary Beth Becker-Lack. I'm the Domestic Violence Community Educator at Women's Advocates. And today's webinar, Understanding Historical Trauma and Its Impact on Native and Indigenous Victim Survivors, is going to feature a guest speaker. And I am thrilled to introduce you all to our presenter, Lori Jump, who is the Executive Director of Strong Hearts Native Helpline, a national hotline supporting Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Lori is a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and serves as a tribal appellate court judge. In addition to her work at Strong Hearts, Lori is a founding executive director and board member of Uniting Three Fires Against Violence. She has served on a federal task force researching violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women, and has more than 30 years of experience in tribal program development, victim survivor advocacy, and tribal court. Lori, thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us. I am going to stop talking now and let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to work with you all and bring our more education to people that are working and serving Native Americans. I think this is a critical piece of the work that we all do. So let me see. Oh, now why isn't this working? Sorry. Do I have to? There we go. I think maybe I have to click instead of hitting an arrow. Mary Beth just introduced me. Lori Jump. I am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. I've been doing this work for a really long time. And today, I'm the director for Strong Hearts Native Helpline. I want to start out with just a land acknowledgement. Wherever you are joining us today from, you are on ancestral lands. And what that means is that, in our history, there were our ancestors, our tribal ancestors, cared for the land that you're standing on, right? And it was through their care and stewardship of the land that it remains today. So we give thanks for their stewardship. Strong Hearts is located on the lands of the Sault Ste. and Wapakute peoples in Eagan, Minnesota. I personally am today coming to you from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is the land of the Anishinaabe, of which I am a citizen. So to get started, I'll just say this. I've never been a history fan, right? I've always been the first one to say that, it happened, it's over. Like, what, let's learn from it. Let's let it go, right? Let it go and let's get over it, right? And that was until I actually started to learn about the actual history of my ancestors. And to be honest, it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I was still, even as a Native American, saying, oh my gosh, we have to let that stuff go, right? And so, people that have always said those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I just, to be quite honest, was never quite a believer in that. I thought, let's learn from it and then move on. But so for me, it's not just that we're doomed to repeat it. It's that we won't have the opportunity to heal. And I think that's the bigger piece for me when I'm thinking about my relatives in Indian country is that, you can't heal from things that you don't know impact you, that are not acknowledged, and for which you don't have the resources to heal from. So this is pretty important to me. So today we will talk about, the definition of historical trauma and really recognize the ongoing impact that trauma has today on Native Americans across the country. 72%. This is actually kind of crazy to me. 72% of Americans rarely get information about Native Americans. You know, and that just contributes to so many things, right? The invisibility of Native Americans, the belief that, you know, there aren't any real Indians left in this world. You know, myths and stereotypes all just continue to impact the way we live today. And it's because 72% of us don't get information about Native Americans. And so I guess I would have expected that the one place that you could be expected to learn about Native Americans and really to get correct information would have been schools. But these statistics tell a different story. You know, the teaching about Native Americans and our Native history is not a requirement in state standards. In 87, or I'm sorry, it was 72%. Also, 87% that do cover some form of Native American history do not cover Native American history after 1900. So what you're learning about is that very early piece that still was very traumatic, still impacts us today and very important, but it again contributes to those myths and you know, stereotypes about who and what Indians are, right? 27 states do not even mention Native Americans in their state standards for education. And so is it any wonder really that people don't understand, you know, Indian country, Native Americans, our history, and what we continue to deal with today. So today, you know, what we're going to talk about is, you know, colonization, the historical trauma and the impacts, you know, the importance of tribal sovereignty, jurisdictional issues, all of these things that really have such a huge impact on Native Americans today. And when we talk about colonization, I guess first I should probably start out by saying this, right? Not only am I a proud citizen of my tribal nation, but I'm also a proud citizen of the United States. And sometimes I can sound like maybe I'm not when I'm telling this part of our history, because it angers me when I think about all of the things that have happened to our people and really what the intent of these laws were. You know, it does make me angry. But I do love my country. I'm a very proud citizen of the United States. And so I just want to state that because I don't want y'all to think I'm not. Colonization is not just about Columbus, right? It's about so much more that continues to happen today, that still impacts us today, and that most people still don't really realize what has happened. You know, so all of these dates that are up on the screen are important because they all had a great impact on Native Americans. You know, Native Americans were not citizens of the United States until the Snyder Act was passed in 1924. You know, we had the pre-1800s, it was all about extermination, manipulation, colonization. Really that extermination was the big piece of it, right? Was how do we get rid of Native Americans who occupied the land that we want? And it really just was about power, land, and money. You know, the Removal Act moved Indians in the 1830s to west of the Mississippi. And you may have learned some of this in history class, right? But what you didn't learn was prior to forcing the Native Americans to move to west of the Mississippi, what the U.S. Army did was they went out and they basically annihilated the buffalo, you know, all of the wildlife that lived in that area. And it caused, you know, again, not just this trauma of being forced to leave your homelands, but you were forced onto land that wasn't hospitable, that didn't have wildlife to feed your family, you know, and so there was starvation, right, which was intentional. And so that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about learning our history and really understanding what really happened to us. And then we entered into the 1930s. There was this, the Wheeler-Howard Indian Reorganization Act, and you'll find that a lot of tribal governments, even today, still have IRA constitutions. My tribe does, which allowed tribes to establish elected governments. Less than 20 years later, there was the termination policy in 1953, and it really terminated many tribes' status as Native nations. The Indian Civil Rights Act was imposed in 1968 to ensure individual Indian similar rights. What it also did was limited our ability to prosecute and really penalize people who were committing crimes against Native Americans. In 1970, the self-determination policy, and this is kind of where we're at today, where tribes are recognized, as tribal nations, and the governments have a government-to-government relationship with each other. And there's this policy of allowing tribes to self-determine what they want in their communities and what they don't want, right? And so that's been very impactful. In 1978, I'm sure that you've heard about the Indian Child Welfare Act. It was enacted in 1978. And what it does was requires state courts to follow placement of Native children in Native homes. And the reason it was enacted is that because prior to that, Native children were removed from their tribal homes by just the thousands, and they weren't placed in Native homes. So they were taken again, away from their families and placed in homes that did not recognize any of their language, their traditions, their culture, all of that, again, taken from them. And it was so bad that, we had to have a law passed to ensure that if a state court was removing a Native child, they have a responsibility to work with that tribal nation to find an appropriate placement for the child. And so, these are, again, all very important, but they don't even stop there, right? There are ongoing challenges to tribal sovereignty, to different, rights that are guaranteed to Native Americans. In fact, there's the Supreme Court just recently announced that they are going to be hearing a case that is challenging the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so, again, when we talk about colonization, it's not something that happened back in the 14 and 1500s. It really is, there are ongoing attempts to, that continue those, beliefs and traditions and actions that of colonization. So the majority of, all of those acts that we talked about earlier really were harmful to Native Americans. Some, I think, were worse because they were mostly successful. And one of those that I feel was probably is what I know most about is the boarding school era. Children were taken forcibly from their families at very young ages. And in some cases, they were never returned. Some cases, they were kept for years. And in many cases, children died there. But upon arrival, they were stripped of absolutely everything that they knew, from their name to their hair, their clothing. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to practice their own spiritual beliefs. They weren't allowed to, practice their traditions. So everything that they knew, right? Their family, their community, everything was taken from them. And if they returned home, they no longer look like they did when they left. You can see these two pictures, right? They look very differently. They're, they don't look anything alike. And so for their communities, they were considered too white. They really did not fit into their own communities anymore, and they were not accepted. But by mainstream society, they could never be white enough. You can take their hair, you can give them an American name, you can make them speak our language, make them dress like us, but we would never be white enough to be fully accepted into that society. And so, it just is never, to me, there's no wonder that we feel so disenfranchised, so disconnected from Main Street society, even today. The impacts of this is just ongoing. Whoops. How do I go back? Ha! I keep going, down here, sorry. So talking about historical trauma, I do actually do these presentations, and yet I mess them up all the time. I'm so sorry. Historical trauma is really a collective trauma suffered by a group of people due to historical events that were destructive to their physical, mental, emotional, cultural, and spiritual way of life. And I think when you look back at all of the things that I just showed you on the previous slide, there's no way that you can deny that Native Americans have experienced historical trauma. And, it's just looking at it, our entire history as Native Americans from the moment of contact has been traumatic. And I think a lot of us still don't know that. As I said, this is not taught in schools, right? The little bit we get. Somebody was telling me recently that, their child came home this past year and were able to choose who they wanted to be in their classroom play. Did they want to be a pilgrim, or did they want to be an Indian for the big feast? And it's just like, to still be presenting these stereotypes in our schools is disturbing, right? And so there's lots of room for change and lots of room to be better at what we are teaching our children. But I think that we still don't talk about it. For those of us even that know about the historical trauma, and I am not an expert in this, I know this much when you look at the big picture. But the reality is we still don't talk about it enough. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't know what it is, we don't heal. And I think that we end up passing that trauma on to our children, and then they don't know why their family is this way, and they pass it on to their children, right? We just never have this opportunity to really talk about what our ancestors went through and why they parented the way they did, why they had substance abuse problems, why they had poor coping skills. I think we could directly tie back to our history, and I think I'm not talking about making excuses for, I'm not making excuses for people. I'm talking about the reasons they are the way they are. So that it's not excuses. It's they have a reason for it, right? And historical trauma is the name that carries. So the impact, of historical trauma is, and I think this looks a little different. I may have grabbed the wrong slides. The impact of historical trauma really, as I said, impacts our people today. There are just these feelings of disconnect, being angry and not really sure why, poor coping skills, leading to, the drugs and alcohol use, low self-esteem, disempowered. We don't trust people that say that they're here to help us. You know, and really it all adds up to a reduced capacity to overcome or heal from trauma, right? We don't have the coping skills or the strategies to overcome the current abuses that we are experiencing. And so when we look at the statistics of violence in Native American populations, they are outrageous, right? 83% of our people have experienced violence in their lifetimes. 56% of women have experienced physical violence. 63% report being tracked by their partners, so stalking. 56% of women have experienced sexual violence. And when we look especially at that violence, the sexual violence, 97% of that has been at the hands of interracial partners, so not Native Americans, right? And that's a very important statistic when we get further into the presentation and when we start to talk a little bit about jurisdiction and prosecution, because our ability to prosecute has been severely limited. And then you look at the federal government, who declines to prosecute 75% of sexual assault cases in Indian country. So these are really very important statistics that we're talking about.
Lori, can you tell us whether those statistics are from the Indian Health Service or the CDC, or where those are coming from? We have a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, you know, it depends, right? And so what we've tried to do over the years, there are different reports that have looked at the statistics of tribes that are reporting into the federal systems, right? And so that reporting has been, it's been difficult to get accurate statistics, right? Because number one, they don't all report. Number two, the federal government, well, doesn't always report things accurately, or, well, I shouldn't say that. What I should say is that because there has not been this well-planned system of collecting these statistics, what I call rape maybe not meet the definition of what another tribe calls it, right? As a tribal nation, they have the ability, all tribes have the ability to implement codes and definitions and, decide what penalties that they attach to those. And they don't always match up, right? They don't always match up to, the definition of domestic violence in one tribe may not match what's in another. It may not match what the state calls it. It may not match what the federal government calls it. So there's a great difficulty in looking at all of that and having really definitive statistics, right? Much of the statistics that I had on that previous slide came from the National Institute of Justice study. It was done over a period, I believe, starting in 2010, but did not get reported out in 2016. So you can look at that study for, the majority of the statistics that I shared on the last page. So intersectionality is really important when you're working with Native American tribes, right? When you're talking to people who are coming to you for help and you find yourself struggling to understand why they're doing the things they're doing or why they're not doing the things they're doing, access to justice is a huge problem for our communities. Ineffective law enforcement responses, or maybe they don't even have a law enforcement. Not all tribes do. Lack of resources, again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. But then just on a personal level, that, that invisibility that we feel because we're not seen, we're not taught about, we're not seen in media. Our cases don't get the same coverage as another case will get. So all of these things really impact how we experience violence and why it's might be different from what you're used to seeing. And now my mouse won't go over. Okay. So tribal sovereignty is really at the core of advocacy, right? And it's critical that we just really understand, again, all of what that means. As sovereign nations, again, tribes have the responsibility and the authority to establish tribal justice systems, including tribal courts and law enforcement. They enact tribal codes and laws to protect their communities. They have the authority to define the crimes and the remedies, all of that and more, right? They do it all, just as, the state and federal governments do. And again, here's another one. So they do all of that, but there are limitations, right? And that's important to know, that we are defined, starting with the US Constitution, we are defined as dependent nations. And so we do have a lot of requirements placed on us, right? Many things are determined by Congress, what we can and cannot do. And then, you look at, so the Supreme Court will issue findings and opinions that impact us and further diminish our authority. So again, looking at some of the things that limits tribal authority, again, the US Constitution, the Major Crimes Act, Public Law 280, Indian Civil Rights Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and again, some more recent laws, the Violence Against Women Act, Tribal Law and Order Act. Those are some more recent laws that actually have started to restore some of our inherent authority. One of the most important cases has been Oliphant v. Suquamish in 1978. And what that law did, what that finding did from the Supreme Court, was it eliminated a tribe's inherent sovereign authority to prosecute non-Indians for crimes that they committed on tribal land. So it really created this situation where, as a non-Native person going onto reservation lands, and let's face it, there are many mixed couples, right? Native Americans marry people from all over the country. They don't just marry Native Americans. And so you have a couple one is Native and one who is not. And we have an incident of domestic violence, and tribes no longer have the authority to prosecute that person. And if the federal government does not pick that case up, then nothing happens, right? And so it is the only place really in our country where who you are determines whether or not you can access justice. It's why so many cases go unprosecuted. It's why so many victims do not bother to report the crimes committed against them, because oftentimes nothing happens. And so why call, right? And this is what jurisdiction looks like in Indian country. So when somebody calls and there is a crime that involves a Native person and a non-Native person, or really any person, there's a whole process that people have to go through that, first law enforcement has to decide whether or not they even have the authority to maybe detain somebody. Then it's, is this the FBI's jurisdiction for investigation? Is this the state's jurisdiction to prosecute? It's very confusing, right? And this is a kind of a cheat sheet on jurisdiction, where, our people that we put in place to protect us, our law enforcement, our prosecutors, our judges, have to go to this and say, do I have the right to arrest? Do I have the right to detain? Do I have the right to jail? Do I have the right to prosecute? Do I have the right to punish? All of that, right, depends upon these jurisdictional charts that make it very difficult to understand. And cases are sometimes made in, decisions are made in split seconds and often wrong. You might, not arrest somebody thinking they're not a Native American. You might not arrest somebody thinking it happened off trust lands. As many of you know, I'm sure, we don't have boundaries, we don't have fences, and quite often our lands are remote areas, with forests and rivers and, mountains sometimes. And so where is that jurisdictional line? And sometimes it's so close that it's difficult to know. I would highly recommend watching the play Sliver of a Full Moon, if you have not done that. It was written by Mary Catherine Nagel. And, she, in it, 5 or 6 women tell their stories, and they're all stories where, prosecution, where justice was very hard to find, if they got it at all. And it would help you to understand. In one of the women was at work, and her husband came to work and actually shot her, or shot at her, I should say. And, the road he was on was state. She was working for the federal government in a federal office. So, but then they had to say, well, is this trust land or is this still state land? Where exactly did the bullet fall? It's incredibly complicated. And so, obviously I don't expect anybody to here to understand this or memorize it, because nobody memorizes it. It's that, there are some real quick things. Oh, are they Native? Is he non-Native? That's a first real quick, but then other stuff piles in, right? And makes it so difficult. So again, when we look at, access to justice specifically, we see that the jurisdictional issues can create almost an something that you cannot overcome. It's literally a maze, and often there are not people there to help a victim determine how to get through that maze. A huge thing for us are resource disparities in Indian country. We don't have enough services. When I talked about that ability to heal, right, and having resources that you need to heal, healthcare, access to mental health therapy, access to substance abuse services, access to rape crisis centers, all of that makes it difficult for our people to not only find justice, but to even start the healing process. And so, Strong Hearts is the first national helpline for Native Americans that have been impacted by domestic or sexual violence. It is confidential and anonymous, Native-centered and trauma-informed. We take calls from across the country and have taken international calls as well. Our advocates receive about 80 hours of initial training. And although it's much more in depth than what's listed here, these are some of the specific to Native American and Alaska Native population that we do cover. Our advocates are not legal advocates, but they have to have an understanding of the barriers that our people face in order to be able to really help them the best, right? So again, we cover a lot about Native cultures. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in this country, and they are each unique. Their tribal governments are unique. Their culture, their spirituality are each different from the other, right? From the one next to them. And so we obviously don't expect our advocates to understand all of that, but they have to understand, that they are sovereign nations. They have to understand our history of historical trauma. They have to understand jurisdiction so we can point people in the right direction for the help that they need. Oh my gosh, for some reason my mouse gets stuck and it won't go. So who Strong Hearts serves? I think we serve whoever calls us, right? But we are specifically targeting American Indian and Alaska Natives. And the reason for that is, back in about 2012, the National Domestic Violence Hotline was reviewing their data, and they, were confused as to why, in spite of the very high rates of violence that our people experience, Native Americans really did not reach out to the hotline for help. And so they reached out and started having conversations with really grassroots advocates and, experts in the field, people that were doing the work in Indian country. And they found out that, Katie Ray Jones, who is the executive director, the CEO for the National Hotline, said, that they really thought that they would set up some training for their staff. But what they found out was that really they should not be doing this work, that because of our history and the barriers that we face, and especially with relating to reaching out to mainstream organizations, that it really was best to establish a culturally specific hotline for Native Americans that would be built by and built for Native Americans. So that's kind of how we came to be. We have, our database really is the first of its kind. We spent the first year of our operations really reaching out to all of the tribes across the country and saying, who's doing this work in your community? Because we know that not everybody has a domestic violence program. We know that not everybody has a domestic violence shelter. Probably, well, I want to say none have rape crisis centers, but I know that that is changing. And what we found were, it was a variety of people, not only the ones that I've mentioned, but also behavioral health might be doing it. Tribal social services might be the people that are working with victims of domestic and sexual violence. Some medical facilities would, maybe a nurse would handle cases that came in. And so it is very varied across the country. Like I said, we have 267 Native-centered direct services in our database today. That compares to about 3,600 resources that are available in the National Domestic Violence Hotlines database. So you can see the resource disparity that I'm talking about. When we look at domestic violence shelters, we have 59 in our database. In the national database, there are, I want to say 1,500 and maybe 50. And so there's quite a resource disparity, but we're very lucky that we do have access to the national hotline. You know, as a partner of theirs, they've opened up their resource database to us so that when somebody calls us, we're able to say, okay, I can tell you that in your area, there is not a Native-centered resource, but you have 3 other resources available to you. And so that we can make those referrals. And I think what's really important to note is that when we are making a referral for somebody, we don't just give out numbers, right? We try to do what we call a warm handoff, where we will contact the resource first, determine if they're able to help the person that's calling us. And then if they are, we will then, add the 3 of us to a 3-way phone call, and our advocate will then exit the call. That way, somebody that calls us isn't hearing a lot of no's, right? We're not saying, here are 3 numbers, give these people a call, and then they're hearing no, 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 right? We're hearing that on their behalf, so that we know it's very hard to reach out for help. And when you hear no, it's harder to make that second call. And so we try to really limit that as much as we can for those who are calling us by making those calls and trying to find the resources and then connecting them, right? And so that's very important to us. Again, I think that competent advocacy must always come through the historical trauma lens. We have a responsibility to understand the history of those that we are working with and how it impacts their lives today. It's hard to really have a genuine connection or build trust and rapport with somebody if you don't know their lived experience. And so I think that that's just a really important piece. And again, there are 574 tribes out there. There are big differences between how Alaska tribes are organized and the lower 48. Everybody doesn't live on a reservation. What we call a reservation here in my area, might be called a village. It might be called a pueblo. In some places in California, they're called rancherias. Don't lump us all together, right? We have to understand that although there are many things that tie us together in terms of, some of our belief systems and the just the sacredness of life and respecting all living things, but there are many differences as well. In your advocacy, again, avoid those overgeneralizations, right? Always come from an empowerment and based approach, speaking from a trauma-informed lens, focus on safety planning. It's going to look very different for somebody that might be coming from a reservation, especially in the more rural ones who may not have like a 911 address. Understanding the difference between civil and criminal remedies in Indian country is going to be really important. And recognize, I know that I think when we first start doing this work and working with victims of domestic and sexual violence, our first thought is, oh my gosh, they have to leave, right? They have to get out. But that's not ours. And that's what we would call a success when they do leave. But success for a victim of domestic violence may be very different for them than what we would expect. And so we have to make sure that we're coming at them from where they're at and letting them make those decisions. And when we talk about leaving, especially for somebody that is living on a reservation or on their trust property, their village or pueblo, leaving everything that they know behind, even just to move to the town that's outside of their reservation is going to be traumatic for them. They may be leaving their entire support system behind. They're leaving, the protection of their community behind. And so the implication of leaving is huge. And it actually takes me back to the boarding school era where so much was taken from us, right? And sometimes maybe they don't have a choice and they'll choose to do that, but it's a huge decision. These are some resources that might be helpful to you in your advocacy. Obviously, we hope that you would, if you were working with somebody, we would hope that you would provide Strong Hearts as an additional resource for those you're working with. And as somebody that's working in the field, you can always reach out to Strong Hearts for information. One of the things that we do quite often, we get a lot of what we call administrative calls, and just, people that are looking for resources in Indian country that they may not know of, right? Maybe looking for, traditional services, somebody may want to, for me, I always use sweat, like have a sweat in as a traditional service, right? It's a ceremony. Again, that would look very different to a tribe out west or in the Northwest who may not use these same traditional ceremonies, but we can kind of help you track those down too if that's something that someone you're working with is looking for. Off to the right, I have a lot of some additional resources that will have some really great information for you. The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center has been one of our partners, one of our we say our organizational parents that helped us really get to where we are today. The National Congress of American Indians has some great information. The Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, if you're lucky enough to have a tribal coalition in your state, they will have that information for you. Turtle Talk is a great, there are a lot of blogs for helping you to understand different issues in Indian country and kind of what's happening. The Tribal Court Clearinghouse is a great resource. And I think the Tribal Court Clearinghouse actually has like a listing of different tribal codes that could help you understand maybe what's happening on a specific reservation. So there are a lot of resources out there. Our website actually has some interesting blogs and information that would be helpful as well. So you can find us at strongheartshelpline.org. We are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We've launched a YouTube page. We don't have a lot on it yet. We're just kind of starting to get going in the areas of videos, but we'll get there. And I guess that is my presentation. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer what I can.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. We have so many questions in the chat. I have a couple of questions of my own that I'm going to ask too, because I'm curious as well. But we have a couple of questions particularly about jurisdictional issues.
Mhm.
So someone asks, how do you expect the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act that was just signed into law this past week, how do you expect that to impact these jurisdictional issues, if at all?
Yeah, it's going to be huge. I just have to share because I'm so excited. I was actually in DC and was invited to the President Biden's remarks on the Violence Against Women Act, and he's just so wonderful. His speech was wonderful. There were a lot of Native Americans there that had worked on the bill. And we're so excited to see it get signed into to be authorized. So one of the things that in 2013, one of the pieces of the legislation restored jurisdiction for tribes to prosecute domestic violence cases where a non-Native person had abused a Native person on tribal land. So that was a very tiny piece. And again, that goes back to that play that I told you about, Sliver of a Full Moon, and how we were able to get that piece of jurisdiction back. So this newest, I guess it'll be the 2022 Act, will restore jurisdiction for sexual assault to tribes. And so tribes will now be able to prosecute sexual assaults that occur on tribal land. That is huge. I think it's important to know that really very few tribes have actually implemented this restored jurisdiction. And there are many reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons, when in 2013, there was a pilot project with the Bureau of Prisons that said that any implementing tribe that issued a penalty of more than 1 year would be able to place those defendants into federal holding cells, right? So federal prisons. That was a very short-lived project. I believe it only lasted for 3 years, and then it expired. So when tribes are considering these cases, taking them to trial and prosecuting and then punishing, we've been left with very few options for punishment and very restrictive. It did increase also our ability to place somebody in detention for up to 3 years, right? But what comes along with that is the cost of putting somebody in jail for 3 years, which is significant. More importantly, it also requires the sentencing authority to cover any medical bills that occur while the defendant is in custody. So if somebody in jail for a domestic violence incident were to get into a fight with another inmate in jail and experience significant injuries, and we know it happens, right? Then the tribes were then responsible for the medical care for that person. And so that has been a huge deterrent to tribes in implementing these restorations of jurisdictional authority because of the costs that come along with them. This newest reiteration of VAWA does establish the Bureau of Prisons project. It does bring it back. So tribes will now have access to that. So if they have somebody who comes onto a property and commits, an egregious act of domestic or sexual violence that really they feel needs to be sentenced to more than 1 year in custody, they'll have an opportunity to use the federal properties which have, higher levels of monitoring, less violence between inmates, all of that will, I think, reduce the cost for tribes and will, result in more tribes implementing these restored authorities.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah.
That's so exciting.
It's really exciting.
First of all, because so much of this seems like the jurisdictional issues are so strange. Like, okay, this prosecution or investigation is left up to the FBI, but the FBI is not going after, like, pursuing these cases. So nobody gets to pursue these cases.
Yep.
That is, I mean, when you talk about historical trauma and like distrust of systems, like that's not something we left in the termination era. That's with us right now.
Yeah, I can tell you, I'll tell you about a case that I know about personally that I worked with. There was actually the death of a child, which obviously the Major Crime Acts would automatically send that to federal prosecutors for prosecution. The investigation was ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. And 5 years in to the investigation, 5 years, the U.S. attorney actually made a visit to Michigan, and representatives from our tribe questioned, why is it taking 5 years to prosecute the case of a death of a child? And basically, within the next year, that case was prosecuted successfully and resolved. So they had what they needed. They did not move on it, and that was completely at their discretion. It was not until, the U.S. attorney was here, and we brought it to his attention that it forced the prosecution forward. So, when we look at our federal courts in each of our states, they have huge discretion on which cases they take and which cases they don't, as do local attorneys, right? The difference is that, at a local, if something happens in your county, you can go and you can talk to the prosecutor, you can ask why it's not moving forward. You can do things in, organized protests and things like that. And it just doesn't quite work the same way when you're, working with the U.S. attorneys from your districts in your state. And so they have huge discretion to determine what cases they're going to take. The 2010 Tribal Law and Order Code did result in a requirement for U.S. attorneys to now provide yearly reports on their rates of declination, right? Cases that they decline, and, provide not detail that would tell you anything about the crime, but provide justification for not prosecuting those cases. And so I think that we've seen some improvement in their, just being more responsive. But again, jurisdiction continues to be a huge issue for our people. With somebody outside our control making those decisions. And so this is another restoration of tribal authority that I think will help increase the access to justice for victims, for sure.
Hopefully, thank you. We have a couple of other questions about Strong Hearts. I'm wondering if Strong Hearts Helpline is connected in any way or affiliated with the National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, either task force or the movement to focus attention towards them?
Yeah, well, when we look at especially the murder of women, and 75% of murdered Native American women are murdered at the hands of their either their current or former intimate partner. So we know that the murder of women is definitely connected to domestic violence. It's at the far end of the range of violence that people that people experience. And so we know that there is a connection there. We do take some calls. We are not experts in, certainly missing people. We do offer training to our advocates about what that looks like and potentially where they should send people for help. We definitely need to do more of that. The movement is starting to pick up, right? And you're hearing more about it, and people are organizing, getting better organized. And so, I think you'll see that, like I said, there definitely is a connection. We do assist when people contact us, but I think we'll see more building of infrastructure around that issue, in the coming years.
And I'm thinking a lot about the slide you showed early in the presentation about colonization and how it all started and is continuing to happen. And I'm thinking, like, gosh, this really is mimicking the power and control wheel. This is really like the United States government engaging in colonization was engaging in power and control tactics. Like, not just we talk about how domestic violence isn't just physical, but it's verbal, emotional, spiritual, and a lot of what the government and colonists were doing to the people were annihilating food sources, spiritual and cultural abuse, all of these things that are domestic violence on this macro scale. I don't have a question about that. I'm just thinking, like, it's all things are delicately interconnected.
Yeah, for sure. Right. And I think that's where, as I said, I can start to sound like an angry person when we talk about these things. But I think it's important for not just Native Americans to know this history, but, for everybody to know our history. This is what our country is founded on, and we've made great mistakes, and we haven't done so much acknowledgement of that. You see in Canada, I think they're further along than we are in the work that they're doing around the missing and murdered Indigenous women there. I think we'll get there. There's never been, I think, a true acknowledgement, of the genocidal policies, really, of the United States early on. And I don't think, I'm not saying that the people today are responsible for that, but I do think we have a responsibility to know it. And I think we have a responsibility to try to correct it where we can. And so, that's what we advocate for. Is really starting. Okay, now we have some government action around MMIW, but let's move it beyond let's get together and task force talk about it. What are we going to do, right? What are the action steps?
Absolutely. So in terms of action steps that advocates can do in their own work on their own day-to-day. We have a question about if there are specific warning, there are warning signs for historical trauma, but what do we, as for non-Native advocates who might be working in shelters or in community-based programs with American Indian, Alaska Native survivors, what do we look for in terms of, is this how is historical trauma impacting this person's life, if it is at all? And then how do we broach that subject, or do we broach that subject in a responsible and caring way? So like, I imagine maybe doing a warm handoff to Strong Hearts and saying, hey, if you're at all wanting to be connected to this particular community or this particular resource, I imagine that would be a part of the interaction. But how do we show up as non-Native advocates, who many of us served on this call? How do we show up for the victim survivors that we serve who are Native or Indigenous in a way that isn't saying, yes, you're Native, so I am sure you're suffering from historical trauma, let me help you figure this out? How do we show up in a way that is helpful and useful and compassionate?
Yeah, I think that, obviously you're not going to say, oh, historical trauma, that's what's wrong, right? You're not going to do that. And I know that as advocates, that nobody on this call would do that, right? I think it really is about being aware that, being aware of those things though, and thinking through how that might be impacting them in their current situation, right? I know, there is no such thing as a perfect victim, that many are victims that come to us have poor coping skills and have other issues that are impacting their life. But really understanding that, when people they don't want to cooperate with law enforcement, there might be a reason for that. They may have reported something 3 and 4 times before and gotten nothing, right? Understanding that when somebody is in shelter and maybe they aren't the best parent. You know what? When you come from a family whose parents were in boarding school, they were raised in an institution. They did not have the example of a loving family. And so, what's a normal parenting skill for them might not be what we consider appropriate, but understanding they may not have ever learned that, right? They may not have learned appropriate parenting skills because they never had them. And so I think that giving grace, right, in those situations and understanding, especially in that situation around parenting, I know that we likely are all mandatory reporters, right? And understanding the fear that might generate in somebody when you say those words to them, right? That they may have siblings who were removed for their family and given to somebody else and lost all contact. They may have aunts and uncles. Their parent may have been placed in a foster home. I mean, we just don't know, right? What somebody's complete background is. And so really understanding and thinking through how all of this might be impacting, and maybe it's not, maybe it's not. But the possibility that it is larger than the possibility that it isn't, that they haven't experienced these things at some point in their life.
Yeah, someone in the chat is responding, just ask what they need.
Yeah, one of the things that, when we're talking, what our advocates are talking, and I'm sure y'all do this too. It's, how are you taking care of yourself, right? Like, are there traditional services that you need? Are there traditional services that maybe you practice at home that we can help you find here, right? And making space for those, I think is really important. Thinking about, many times people will refer people to their church, and maybe they don't use a church, but maybe what they do is, a sweat. Maybe what they do is smudging, maybe, that type of thing, and traditional healers that their community might have. And so I think just being aware that, number one, those resources hopefully exist in their community, and that you can help them to access those would be important.
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions. One is, again, a jurisdictional question, because that is so tricky,
Yes.
and maze-like that no wonder people have questions. But someone is wondering whether strong hearts or whether tribal nations in general are able to sort of put the pressure on local police departments to utilize and test rape kits in cases of sexual assault that may have happened on tribal land. Wondering what the ability of tribal governments, and maybe of strong hearts if you have an ability to do that, is to kind of pressure the non-tribal law enforcement to actually test and use those kits.
Yeah, that's not something that Strong Hearts does. That's kind of out of our realm. We really are just this direct service to victims. I do think being an advocate, and I worked in my tribal community for a long time. You know what? If you are an effective advocate, if you are a good advocate, your local law enforcement might not like you, right? Your job isn't to make friends with the prosecutor or the judges or the law enforcement. Your job is to make sure that women get what they need to be safe, to get justice, right? To get healing, all of those things. I mean, I know it's not necessarily your job to get all of that, but it's to advocate for that. And I think that you can do that effectively. But again, people may not like you, right? I can tell you from experience, there were a lot of people in my own community that didn't like me at work because I had high expectations. When are you going to get to that? What's going on? Who's doing this? Who can I talk to, right? People don't like being questioned about how they're doing their job or whether they're doing their job, but somebody has to do it. And you know what? It can't be the victim. She often doesn't have a voice, right? She doesn't have a seat at the table. I would say if you're working in this field, there are task force in your community, get on them, right? Get a seat at the table and then do that work. And we all know, what do they say? The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Like, not just taking no, asking that same question. And when they get angry and said, you brought it up last week, well, you still haven't done anything. I mean, I think we can do that in respectful ways, although I've often not been respectful, because you do get angry. But I think we can do that work in respectful ways that still demands action.
Absolutely. And I think there is a place in respect for anger and for righteous indignation. Absolutely. Like maybe it's not professional and maybe it's not respectful, but neither is the crime of sexual violence. So
right.
Maybe we don't just be polite about it, because it is serious.
Yeah, I think sometimes that the space for polite conversation is over, right? I mean, I think that in most cases, unless you're a brand new advocate, we've had those conversations with our law enforcement. We've had those conversations with our prosecutor, right? And I think sometimes it has to go beyond that. It has to become demanding, yeah, I'm I'm an advocate for advocates, to not necessarily be the most liked member of the team. You're the one that's going to be asking questions, those hard questions.
Yeah. So much of our job as advocates and for people who are in direct services is not to be, you're right, it's not to be liked, it's not to make friends, it's to get it done. It's to find the ways to make the thing happen for the person who needs it. And You can't just do that by saying, hey, please, maybe could you think about doing this, please? Someone in the
Yes,
chat saying well-behaved women rarely make history. Yes, absolutely.
exactly.
Yeah. Um, so I have just a couple of questions before we turn things off for the afternoon. One is about distrust of systems as related to historical trauma. Like after everything the government and federal systems and social services programs even have done to Native tribes and families and individuals, um, I obviously it can be not comfortable to try and seek assistance from those same services, which is part of why tribal programs like tribal social services programs exist. But like so that you're not being forced into the arms of your oppressor for food or WIC vouchers or loans. But what is the dream? What is your dream for social services and violence prevention in Indian country? Like if you had a blank check to get everything that you wanted, what and to make Indian country like an abundant and sustainable place for victim survivors and their families, what would be the first thing that you did that you spent that money on?
I think it would be on shelters. Obviously there are so many needs, right? But what's first? Immediate safety, right? Having someplace to go where you can be safe. I would definitely, advocate for more shelters. We need, and this is not, obviously for Indian country, but it's for all of us, right? 1,500 shelters seems like a lot when I'm comparing it to 59, right? But it's not. How many victims experience, how many women and men, right? How many of us experience violence every year and don't have a safe place to go? Way too many. There are not enough shelters available. But then also the services to heal. I really think that if you're not talking about it, you can't heal. You have to be able to talk about it. And so who do you talk to? An advocate, a therapist, a helpline. You have to start somewhere. And so having access to that is critical. I could go on and on. You all know what the needs are, but for me, I would start with shelters. Yeah.
Speaking of shelters, what are your suggestions regarding telling a victim to leave and go to a shelter when the abusive partner is non-Native and the victim survivor is Native American with children? This person says, we know that the family courts are a mess, and we know it takes a lot of money to mitigate, and we know that abusers often use parental alienation against the victim survivors that leave. So how do we help these survivors knowing that if they go into family court, they're going to be re-victimized?
I'm a believer in telling the truth. And I think that we have to be honest, right? We have to be careful about how we present that information, but we have to be honest about, what options are, about what the potential pros and cons of, steps that somebody is considering taking. And I think we have to be honest, but not coming at somebody like this, you're going to lose your children, right? Having a real conversation about, I'm worried and this is why, right? And so I think it's all in how we present the information. It's all in it really is in building that trust and rapport with somebody, and then having honest conversations about all of it. I think sometimes again, our expectations, our definition of success is going to be different from the survivors that we're working with. And oftentimes when we ask them to do something, and we may think it's not that much, it's not that big, it's not that hard, might be beyond their ability to complete. So it's not only thinking this is what you have to do, it's asking, what do you think you can do, right? What do you think you can do today? And helping them figure that out. We're very lucky in my community to have a shelter, and we've housed many survivors over the years, but one comes to mind, and it was somebody who was uncooperative, not doing what she needed to do, being lazy, right? And staff was like, man, I think you have to come and talk to her, and at that point my office was not in the shelter. And so, I had a conversation with her, and she was like, I don't even know where I'm at today. And she was not being facetious. She said, I can't even think straight, And so, I ended up having a conversation with my staff and saying, you have to give her time. I mean, yes. Has she been here for a while? Yes, she has. But what's wrong with our expectations when we're pushing women who are not ready to take those steps, right? She doesn't feel like she's able to do it. The fact that you think she should be able to do it is not what's important here, right? It's what does she think she can do? And so we had a long conversation as a staff, and we actually, after that case, we did modify some of our expectations. We always wanted for women, safety was number one, but then, we always think that, well, it'd be best if they participated in this. It would be really great for them to do this. But, we also have to give them that time to get to that, to really process what they've experienced. And this case had been really egregious, so she needed extra time, and so we gave it to her, but it really is about what survivors think they can do, not what we think they can do.
Absolutely. And finally, our last question comes from someone who is asking, who should we contact at Strong Hearts if our organization is interested in collaborating on any sort of community-based education?
We have, I think, info@strongheartshelpline.org is probably the best place to send a request. And then our communications team will pass that through, and we are happy to work with any of you all. Thankfully, the COVID situation has really started to abate, and things are getting back to some sort of new normal. And we are really hoping to start getting into communities for events. So if you have something that's coming up in your community and you'd like us to come and either present or, have a table at an event, we're trying this summer to get to as many powwows as we can. We're super excited about that, just so we can be in community with people. But yeah, reach out to us. We have resources that we're happy to send you, and we're starting to travel. I'm really looking forward to I'm in northern Michigan. We still have about 4 feet of snow on the ground. So I'm really looking forward to going, even if it's 2 hours south. Call me, I'll come.
You heard it here first, folks. Lori is looking to go anywhere. All right. Well, Thank you, Lori, so much for coming and sharing your wisdom and your understanding with us. Oh, we've already got a powwow invite in the chat. I learned so much from you every time we talk. I am just thrilled that you were able to share your time with us today. Everybody else who is here, thank you all for coming. There is a Google form in the chat for our post-webinar survey and info about how to get a certificate of attendance. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our interpreters, and thank you, Lori, so much. I'm going to stop recording and we can have the rest of our afternoon.